I'll just let the people who saw me and immediately ran out get out. So I'm one of the not so many academics at this conference. I used to be a school teacher, but I escaped the school classroom because it was too dangerous and decided to be an academic in a university. I'm going to be talking about artificial intelligence in education. Okay, there's been a lot said about artificial intelligence, quite a lot of hype, people claiming it's going to change the world in all kinds of interesting and sometimes rather worrying ways. And I'm going to have a more kind of prosaic view of it. So the talk's going to be in three parts. I'm going to say something about what an artificial intelligence education system is like. I'm going to answer the question, do they work in the here and now? Not in 10 years' time or 100 years' time, in the here and now. And I'll also obviously talk about opportunities and challenges. So one of the impulses of building artificial intelligence systems in education is to capture an insight from Bloom's work back in the 1980s, where he looked at what worked in his education. And his basic comparison was an ordinary classroom with an ordinary teacher. And that would produce a kind of Gaussian curve of results. If you ask the teacher to work in a different kind of a way to ensure that all of the learners got as much as they possibly could, mastery teaching, then you shifted that Gaussian to the right. If you had each student have an individual expert mentor to help them in a three-dimensional way, heart, head, body, then you shift the Gaussian even further. Effectively, you make it the case that everybody with an individual teacher will do, almost everybody will do better than the people who were just in an ordinary classroom. And that idea of trying to personalize education is a cornerstone of building artificial intelligence in education systems. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 4 interfaces of 4 systems and just say something about them very briefly. So this is a system called Betty's Brain. Betty is the young person down there in the left-hand side. The map, the concept map, has been built by the human student, believing that they are, in some sense, educating Betty. Betty starts with an empty brain, and the human learner is trying to fill her brain with good stuff about the ecology of a river system. And that good stuff is a concept map with arrows, which you can reason about. Betty can reason about it, the student can reason about it, the teacher in the background can check to see whether those links make sense or don't make sense. Betty can ask you to say what you think a chain will produce. So do you think that extra plants in the pond will produce more oxygen or more carbon dioxide? Which do you think it is? And everybody, both parties, the human learner, the teacher behind the scene, Betty, can use that as an interface to reason about how those concepts work. The nice thing is, it's not the human student that gets tested, it's Betty. So if Betty gets a bad mark because you gave her a bad brain, it's kind of not so bad as you getting a bad mark. So there's a little bit there of kind of cleverness. Here's another system. For some reason which I can't remember, Americans and indeed the British were interested in having soldiers in Iraq, but they had to learn Iraqi. And they had to learn not only be able to speak Iraqi, but they had to learn something of the culture so that when they approached somebody, whether it was the head of a household or whether it was a child, as in that picture there, they used not just the right words, but the right forms of the words which are appropriate for that kind of interaction. So this was a system that was aimed at young soldiers who typically won't have been outside the USA or the UK, USA in this particular case. And they could do, it was a game-based system, so they could play games, they would have situations, they would learn how to greet somebody politely in order that they might perhaps go into their house, not barge in with a gun, sunglasses and all the rest of it. So there was quite a lot of attention paid to trying to teach them culture through this system. Here was a system quite different. This was about teaching people a little bit about how computer systems work. There was an agent there looking slightly concerned, I would say. I mean, we might argue about what expression is actually on her face, because she could have different expressions. And she was basically empathetic as far as she could. And she would try to make sure that not only was the student learning stuff, but also that if she detected from the student wriggling on the chair, or from the facial expression, or from the words used, that things weren't going well. And she might say, it's clearly this stuff that we're doing just now is a bit boring, let's move on. Okay, so that was one clever thing. She was concerned with the heart side of the learner, because learners are feeling beings. I'm sure I could get everybody in the room to tell us that incident in school where they felt that big because they thought they were doing well and they said something and everybody laughed. Not for the right reason laughing. So to give you a sense of another good thing about it is that it's quite good on the language. So the tutor and the student can type stuff to each other, and in later versions can speak stuff to each other, and in quite a complicated way. Okay? It's all very well Alexa being able to book you a hairdressing appointment, but have a conversation? Yeah. So here the tutor asks a question, the student answers, the tutor realizes what's been said, what hasn't been said, said, okay, can you elaborate a bit more on what you've said? Then my fourth system is a system which is kind of more traditional in the sense. This is teaching algebra. What's clever about it is that it's not a question of asking you a question and then waiting for you to figure out the answer and saying right or wrong to the answer. It looks to see what you're doing, to see the different sub-steps that you take and say, I think that sub-step is not going to lead you towards the answer. Maybe you want to reconsider that. Okay, so it's looking at every step that you take. You've got various ways of working through tables, through graphing, and all the rest of it to get to an answer. But most of the cleverness of the system is focused on you, on that journey through the working, not just at the end when you've done the working. The problems are boring. In a way. A rock climber is currently on the side of a cliff 67 feet off the ground. She can climb on average about 2.5 feet per minute, and then some questions. What you want to know is she going to fall off? Will there be blood? But that's not what this one does, okay? So how do these systems actually work? Well, they've got 4 main components. The domain model, that's the bit of the system that understands the stuff that it's trying to teach. You can't have a system teaching maths if it can't do the maths. You can't have a system teaching you how to speak Iraqi if it can't tell whether you've done it well or badly. You can't have a system understanding what you've just said about a computer system unless it knows about the computer system. So you have the domain model. You have a student model. Now, Alicia was talking about Facebook and the kind of models it built. In a sense, the student model is kind of similar. It's a model that the system has of how much the student knows already, what skills they have, in order that it can choose what is the next best problem and the next best bit of advice to give to that student. Maybe that student is getting despondent. What we'll do is we'll give them a problem that we know they can solve because they need some success. Not going to help them learn, but their heart needs a bit of, bit of tending. There's a pedagogical model. That's the model which says, this is what you do in teaching situations. If you get faced with a student in this situation and you're trying to get the student to that situation, here is the next best thing to do. And you have an interface through which these bits and the student can interact and can reason. Do they work? Well, over the last 7 or 8 years, there have been quite a lot of meta-analyses looking at lots of different evaluations. Many academics make their careers by evaluating systems and then writing about how well they did or didn't do. So then there are another lot of people who make their careers by collecting those things together into a big bundle and saying, okay, well, we've looked at 30 studies, and the answer is yes, over the 30 they work. The biggest evaluation was done on that algebra tutor, and it involved nearly 150 USA schools. It worked over 2 years, 2 one-year studies, and they found in the first year, comparing schools that adopted that system compared to schools that didn't adopt it, couldn't tell much difference. And in the second year, there was a small but significant advantage, an effect size, of those schools that adopted that algebra system in their algebra classes. But there was no direct monitoring of what actually happened in either the ordinary classrooms or the classrooms that augmented with the system. Basically, they just had the post-test. That was all. So it's kind of, huge, much data, but impoverished, which is actually the way of the world at the moment. Here's an example of one of those meta-analyses. These people looked at 39 studies, and they came to the conclusion, having looked at 39 studies, that they've demonstrated their ability to outperform many instructional methods for learning activities, facilitating college-level students' learning in a wide range of subjects, although they're not as effective as human tutors. Well, that's kind of okay with me. Not as good as an individual human, but better than a classroom. Looking at many of those things, I then found quite a lot of these meta-analyses, and I did comparisons against one-to-one teaching and also comparisons against classroom teaching. So this is AI and ed systems versus one-to-one human tutoring. And the fact that the bars are going down indicates they don't do as well. So taken in there, we've got 18 studies altogether. Basically, you get a negative effect size of about minus 0.2, okay, which says that, which is good, that human teachers, a human mentor will work better than an AI system to that extent. But the other bit of news is kind of more positive. Now, this is AI and systems versus classroom teaching. And there are 108, the brown bar is the totality, 180 different evaluations collected together over 6 different meta-analyses. And here the picture is more positive than the other one was negative, and is positive. It's saying there's nearly 0.5 effect size, it's nearly half a standard deviation, better to have an AI system than to have a traditional classroom, which I think is quite good. It's not changing the world, but it's an extra goodie. I think this is kind of relatively benign. And I've indicated on that original diagram I showed of Bloom's work, the 2 arrows show the amount of shift that you'd get by having an AI system compared to a classroom standard deviation. So it's not as good as one-to-one mentorship by a human, and it's not even quite as good as mastery learning, but it is not too bad. So challenges and opportunities. Well, what I've tried to do is I've tried to give you a very quick sense of what an AI system is like. I've told you about some meta-reviews, and the story that comes out is that it's generally positive about AI and ed systems compared to most forms of traditional teaching. For STEM subjects, I have to say. So the reason why it works better for STEM subjects like maths, engineering, computer programming, blah, blah, is because you can build the domain model. I mean, for design, you can build a sort of domain model, but it can't really be as clever as it needs to be to actually offer good advice to the student that's doing the design. STEM subjects are subjects, almost by definition, which have detailed domain models, which then allow you to build the domain model of the system. And there are challenges, clearly, from where we're going. There are technical challenges. They're very expensive to build. They take a long time to put together because you've got to study humans. You've got to go into the classrooms and see what works, what doesn't work, what mistakes do people make, what misunderstandings do they have, so that you can expect those misunderstandings. You can expect those places where students just get the wrong end of the stick and build in stuff into the pedagogic model and into your student model, those kinds of rules. Although there is some language competence in these systems, they're not at the point that a human teacher is in having a conversation with the student, especially if that conversation is about how is it for you as a learner. That's a difficult conversation for a computer to have with you. They can sort of simulate it a bit, but not really. If you say, look, I really can't concentrate on my algebra because my hamster died this morning, they're not really, you're not going to believe it if they try to empathize. You'll think it's not true empathy. So there's language competence and there's the cost. And then there are societal problems too. One is avoiding the threat to teachers' jobs. I'm not advocating, I never have advocated that these systems should replace teachers. We need the human teachers there to introduce the systems, to help the students get the most from the systems, and then to debrief the students about the systems after the event. So human teachers are absolutely crucial. You can't have a school which is simply a set of terminals and you send kids there for 8 hours and feed them if you're lucky. Okay. That ain't going to work. Then it's got to be a human place with some boxes, but the humans manage the boxes. And there's a whole issue about dealing with the personal data that these systems generate, which is the same as for Facebook. And then my final slide, there are opportunities. We can have the idea of highly individual learning for all. We can have the idea it's not just about the mind, it's not just cognitive, it's also affective. It's about the emotions of the learner, and it's about motivation. These systems can try and work on the learner's motivation. I didn't have time to talk about that, but that's one of my pet topics. They can be effective as an assistant to the teacher. I've been a school teacher. Boy, would I have liked to have had an assistant. There are plenty of times where you've got clever kids who need to be occupied and not so clever kids who also need to be occupied. How nice to be able to offload them for a bit rather than have to deal with them all. They do collect useful data. They collect useful data both about the kids, but they also collect useful data about what works in teaching. So we can use these systems to build better AI systems, but also to understand what it is that humans do when they're good teachers. So as a kind of psychology. And we don't maybe need to have so many examinations, because basically these systems are watching what the students are doing, and they can certify that in their view, in their very detailed view, the student is able to do this, understands that, without a further examination. So a positive message, not a hype, but a positive message. Thank you.